10:20 a.m. in Ouagadougou. Under dim yellow lights inside a modest press room, Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked to the podium. No papers in his hand, no foreign advisors behind him, no teleprompter. Just a crisp uniform, a steady voice, and words that shook markets and ocean away. 11 new trade agreements, signed in one stroke, not a single one with the United States. Within minutes, 7 of America's biggest brands, Coca-Cola, Walmart, and more, watched their stock tickers bleed red. Wall Street traders shouted into headsets, boardrooms filled with disbelief. But halfway across the world, in the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was the opposite. Vendors leaned closer to their radios. A fabric seller whispered, "He did it." For some, it meant cheaper rice. For others, it meant jobs that would stay in Burkina Faso instead of flying overseas. Here's the twist. What looked like a market shock in New York sounded like a quiet victory in West Africa. And now the world is asking, has the balance of power in global trade just tilted? Before we dive deeper, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from right now? And what do you choose to buy local instead of imported? Drop your answer in the comments. It tells us more than any statistic could. This is Africa Daily Good News. We bring stories that challenge the way power, profit, and people are connected. If you're watching from the US, you'll see why these moves matter for you too. So hit subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and let's see how far this story really goes. Because what began in a modest press room in Burkina Faso has already reached the heart of America's boardrooms. Wall Street didn't stumble because of a policy paper. It flinched because a microphone turned on in West Africa. One podium, a few sentences, and the trading day in New York bent around a decision made in Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso confirmed 11 fresh trade deals, partners spanning Africa, Asia, and South America, and none with the United States. Markets reacted in minutes. Screens flashed red, risk desks rewrote notes, and 7 familiar American brands felt the floor tilt under their feet. In Washington, language softened from certainty to caution, while staffers drafted statements that sounded firm on TV but hedged between the lines. Customs in Burkina Faso were told to prioritize shipments from new partners and, according to local officials, to staff up border posts so paperwork wouldn't choke logistics before they even began. Regional capitals asked for briefings. A few quietly requested to review contract templates. No U.S. flag on the paperwork, yet the impact landed in American living rooms. If you're in the States, you know how quickly a supply jolt shows up as a higher price at checkout or a thinner shelf. Most Americans, when pressed, prefer predictability over principle until principle starts to look like the only path to predictable jobs. That's the paradox this move exposes. On the ground in Ouagadougou, the story felt different. A vendor tuned a radio with the same hand that weighed rice. Before the announcement, her spreadsheet was hope and guesswork. After, it looked more like a calendar. She wasn't cheering a slogan. She was counting delivery days. That's the human tell. Before, people waited for discounts that never built factories. After, they began asking where the manuals are printed and who gets trained first. From the government's side, the posture was procedural, not theatrical. Officials talked about clauses, technology transfer, local hiring thresholds, penalties for missed milestones. Some of those words have appeared in past deals across the continent, but the enforcement muscle often arrived late or not at all. Here, the promise isn't the clause, it's the plan to enforce it in week 1. If that holds, contracts turn into classrooms and classrooms turn into payroll. There's a choice architecture forming that viewers can feel. Choose A. Reopen doors to legacy suppliers at a discount, prices dip fast, control drifts offshore, and the next shock resets everything again. Choose B. Accept friction now, slower on day 1, costlier in month 1, in exchange for control that stays where the work is done. According to behavioral research, people tend to overvalue the short-term pain and undervalue the compounding of small, local wins. But households also flip when they recognize that local stops being a sticker and starts being a paycheck. 7 American household names slid in unison, but the more important line was invisible. Bargaining power moved a few inches. If you've ever chosen the local coffee because you met the roaster, you already understand the psychology. Conscience isn't the point. Contact is. When production is within driving distance, complaints become fixes. When it's a continent away, complaints become press releases. The audience question writes itself without a lecture. If your town could keep pricing steady by owning more of the process, but it meant paying a little more this month, would you do it? Most Americans say, "What? It depends," and they're right. It depends on trust, on whether the gains show up where the bills arrive. That's why the early metric isn't GDP. It's whether rice gets cheaper for the woman with the radio and whether her delivery log starts arriving on time. Cheaper headlines aren't the same as cheaper staples. Markets cheer when prices drop. Families cheer when reliability appears. Those are different clocks. The first runs in hours. The second sets a rhythm you can plan a school week around. The press room has gone quiet, but the aftershocks are still moving through spreadsheets and loading docks. Somewhere between a blinking ticker in Manhattan and a stamped manifest at a West African border, a new center of gravity is testing its weight. Light at first, then a little heavier, then noticeable. And just as the city exhales after the morning rush, a door down the hall clicks open. Sanctions weren't the first word out of Washington. Sequence was. The instruction that moved through agencies sounded clinical. Stabilize the message, measure the damage, don't create a headline bigger than the problem. On the record, officials talked about monitoring developments. Off camera, staff mapped levers that don't look like levers on TV: export insurance, compliance checks, financing terms. Panels on morning shows shifted tone. Less outrage, more caution, because price indices at home were already running hot. Push too hard, unify the block, go soft, lose leverage at home. That was the dilemma in a single sentence. Markets did what markets do, repriced risk in minutes, then hunted for the next signal. Brokerage notes flagged 7 U.S. brands with exposure to West African shelf space, and logistics desks updated sailing schedules to test alternate routes. In Accra and Dar es Salaam, procurement teams compared partners that promised technology transfer and local hiring in plain language, not brochure speak. No U.S. flag on the contract didn't mean no U.S. footprint, just a fight over where control sits. When interests collide. That's the news frame. The human frame is quieter. An Ohio grocery manager watched wholesale lists tick up 3 cents here, 5 cents there, and asked a routine question that suddenly felt political. Absorb it, or pass it on. Before, global efficiency arrived as a discount and ended as a stockout. After, the conversation became about buffers: who holds them, who pays for them, who benefits when they work. Most Americans, when choices are transparent, will accept a small delay if reliability rises. But only if someone shows the receipts. Burkina Faso, for its part, talked about receipts, not slogans. Customs officers were told to prioritize partner shipments, and border posts got staffing targets tied to pay. Clauses that used to be decoration, local training, maintenance in local languages, penalties for missed milestones, were elevated from page 3 to page 1. The novelty wasn't the clause. It was the intention to enforce it on day 1. If enforcement holds, contracts become classrooms, and classrooms become payroll lines you can circle with a pen. There's a behavioral hinge most viewers recognize. People overvalue short-term friction and undervalue compounding control. Yet habits change fast when outcomes are visible. A port worker who used to wait for missing parts starts asking whether the manual matches the machine. A cafe owner swaps a glossy import for beans, roasted a few districts away. The cup tastes similar, but the invoice feels different. Cheaper headlines aren't cheaper staples. Reliability is a kind of savings Americans rarely see on a receipt. If you're watching this in the US, what's your personal threshold? How much delay would you tolerate if it made the next month more predictable? Washington's trial balloon floated a careful phrase: targeted realignment, while think tanks tested arguments that sound tough without breaking supply chains. Corporations rehearsed 2 decks, one for lower prices fast, one for joint ownership with training that stays when the expats fly home. Both options claim to help families. Only one leaves control where the work lives. And voters don't track white papers. They track whether the same items appear on the same shelf at the same time each week. If this kind of ground-level lens helps you parse the noise, tap like so the algorithm keeps sending you deeper segments instead of surface takes. And tell us one swap you'd actually make, import to local, or the other way around, if it made your week steadier. By late afternoon, screens dimmed and the noise settled into paperwork. Insurance forms, delivery logs, training rosters. The map on the wall didn't change color, but the arrows on it curved a few degrees, as if testing a new path. The kind of shift you don't notice in a flash, until the next door you open feels heavier in your hand. The first U.S. delegation arrived without an invitation. The first surprise was that it didn't matter. Protocol didn't clear a path, paperwork did. On the record, the pitch sounded familiar. Distribution hubs, rapid hiring, affordable prices for families. Off the record, there were two tracks under review in American boardrooms: cut prices hard to flood remaining channels, or propose joint ownership with training that stays after the expats fly home. In Ouagadougou, the response was procedural. Meetings were logged, documents time-stamped, and every offer was filtered through 3 tests: price transparency, local control on supplier selection, and real penalties when promises slip. The lobby felt American. The rules inside did not. Executives expected ceremonial access. They found a wooden bench and a clerk with numbered slips. When the door opened, the presentation was polished: efficiency, speed, national coverage. Traoré listened, then placed a single question where the deck had no slide. Who sets prices when interests collide? Silence did more work than any statement. The lower today, decide elsewhere tomorrow cycle was the logic that used to win. Here, it read like a warning label. Newsrooms reframed the story as quickly as markets did. U.S. primetime panels called it nationalism. Regional outlets called it bargaining power. European correspondents started using a quieter term: realignment, because inflation at home makes moral clarity sound expensive. Brokerage notes flagged 7 U.S. brands with exposure to West African retail. At the same time, procurement offices in Accra and Dar es Salaam asked to study Burkina Faso's contract templates, the parts about technology transfer, local hiring thresholds, maintenance manuals in local languages, and penalty clauses that actually bite. No U.S. on the header wasn't no U.S. in the economy. It was a fight over where the hand on the dial sits. The human layer ran on a different clock. A receptionist who used to wave foreign executives straight to the elevator now asked them to sign the same visitor ledger as everyone else. A factory trainer who once translated borrowed manuals started teaching from pages printed in-country. Torque settings were the same, but the ownership of know-how felt new. If people can connect effort to outcome, they change habits fast. According to most workplace studies, predictability beats charisma once paychecks are on time. That's why, in small offices and loading bays, the shift looked like checklists, not slogans. Most Americans, by habit, will pick the cheaper cart, until the cheaper cart produces the emptier shelf next month. That's not ideology, it's pattern recognition. So a question floats for viewers without being asked out loud. When a country insists on control at the point where prices are set and suppliers are picked, is that protectionism, or is it the only insurance policy that actually pays out when shocks hit? Both answers claim to help families. The test is whether the same items show up at the same time, week after week. By evening, both sides adjusted their tone. Corporations reworked slides to include joint committees and audited training ladders. Ministries circled dates, not headlines, and pushed customs staffing to prevent self-made bottlenecks. In the market near the university, the woman with the radio didn't argue theory. She pointed to a delivery log with fewer blanks than last month. A small thing, but small things, repeated, are how confidence moves from speeches into schedules. The building emptied 1 floor at a time. The bench in the lobby was quiet again. Outside, a truck downshifted as it turned toward the ring road, taillights steady, not rushing, taking a route that didn't exist. On many maps a year ago, and that someone, somewhere, would have to redraw. Critics abroad called it reckless nationalism. Inside Burkina Faso, officials called it housekeeping. The same clauses that once lived on page 4 of contracts, technology transfer, local hiring, clear penalties, were suddenly on the front page. And this time, they were treated like checklists, not decoration. Media split the frame. In Washington, anchors warned that reshaping deals this way could destabilize supply chains. In Paris, headlines framed Traoré as a populist playing with fire. Yet in Ouagadougou, cranes lifted beams for new workshops, and instructors walked apprentices through manuals written in their own language. What foreign commentators painted as chaos looked, on the ground, like order arriving late. Contracts weren't just signed, they were tested. A cooperative leader explained how textile shipments carried enforcement clauses that penalized missed deadlines in cash, not apologies. A fruit processing plant promised schematics and spare parts that could be sourced regionally, not shipped across oceans. The novelty wasn't the promises, it was the demand that those promises survive the first inspection. For families, the effect showed up in smaller ways. A mother who once guessed when flour would arrive at her local stall now pointed to a delivery log posted publicly. A porter at the market signed his first written rate agreement with management, holding it up as proof that labor was finally part of sovereignty. People everywhere, when given proof they can touch, adjust behavior fast. Most Americans, by habit, trust receipts more than speeches. So would you? If the proof was in writing, visible to anyone, would you shift trust toward a system you once doubted? International economists debated whether this was a blueprint or an exception. Studies suggest households tolerate short-term price friction if the long-term trade-off is predictability. That's the hinge of this experiment. The daily inconvenience stacked against the possibility of control that doesn't fly away with the next discount. The markets in New York saw volatility. The streets in Ouagadougou saw schedules. If this kind of deeper look matters to you, hit like so more viewers get beyond the headlines, and let us know in the comments what you'd rather have. Cheaper prices that disappear fast, or slower gains that actually last. The day ended not with fireworks, but with receipts tacked to corkboards, training logs checked off, and the quiet hum of machines that would be tested again tomorrow. And as dusk settled, one question followed people home. Not whether the deals were signed, but whether this discipline could hold when the pressure rises next. Factories didn't close when U.S. brands pulled out. They reopened under new signs. What looked like retreat from afar looked like repurposing up close. Shuttered storefronts in Ouagadougou were stripped, painted, and fitted with shelves for local goods within weeks. The absence wasn't treated as loss. It was treated as a canvas. Reports confirmed that procurement offices across Ghana and Tanzania began running pilot contracts modeled after Burkina Faso's clauses: technology transfer, regional spare parts, penalties for missed milestones. Economists noted the unusual alignment. Separate capitals, different pressures, but similar moves toward collective bargaining. One government's risk became another's template. On the ground, change felt less like revolution and more like rhythm. A student who once debated policy in theory now pointed at cranes lifting beams for a training hall. A market seller who once shrugged at late shipments now pulled out a paper log, showing arrivals that matched the calendar. If people can anchor trust to routine, they adjust faster than policy experts predict. Predictability is not glamorous, but it rewires confidence. In New York, companies face the dilemma familiar to most households: absorb the hit or change the model. Cut prices to flood what channels remain, or accept shared ownership and leave more value where it's produced. Analysts warned that a blunt discount push could look like panic. Investors asked whether a quieter strategy, centered on transparency, would protect long-term access. Most Americans know the choice in their own lives: chase the cheapest option today or pay slightly more for stability tomorrow. Which one they pick often depends not on numbers, but on trust. Inside Burkina Faso's ministries, the focus stayed on basics. Blueprints for a fruit processing plant were reviewed not for glossy design, but for maintenance budgets and local language manuals. Ministers circled projects tied to daily life first: crop storage, rural road links, reliable electricity for clinics. The priority wasn't spectacle, it was utility. And in households, that translated into margins farmers could measure, receipts parents could pin, and routines workers could count on. By evening, the city's noise was less about speeches and more about machines testing their first runs. A cooperative leader showed visitors crates labeled with harvest dates and cooperative names, proof that the supply chain no longer dissolved into anonymity. The camera of attention might linger on contracts and ministers, but the story lived in deliveries, receipts, and habits that were slowly learning a new tempo. And as lights flickered on across the city, the mood carried an edge, relief that something tangible was changing, and the quiet awareness that pressure from outside hadn't even peaked yet. Washington's first real worry wasn't about Africa. It was about unity. Push too hard, and African capitals might line up together. Push too soft, and America's leverage at home would look hollow. That contradiction shaped every memo and every cable. Officials debated sanctions, credit restrictions, even whispered campaigns to paint Burkina Faso as unstable. But internal notes, later leaked, warned that a heavy hand could backfire, turning Traoré from a provincial officer into a continental symbol of self-determination. The phrase that kept surfacing in drafts was careful, measured visibility. It meant cameras could roll, but proof had to outpace propaganda. On the ground, the government leaned into that logic. Journalists were allowed to walk markets without escorts. Cameras caught local shop owners refitting old franchises, apprentices reciting machine settings, and workers signing contracts in public. Instead of spectacle, they offered evidence, delivery slips, payroll sheets, manuals printed in local languages. The gamble was that visibility itself would blunt rumors. For ordinary people, that visibility shifted behavior. A market porter who once took day rates in cash now demanded a written slip with his name. A teacher buying rice noticed the label carried a co-op stamp and a harvest date, details that used to vanish in transit. Most Americans, when surveys ask, say they trust what they can verify more than what they are told. In Ouagadougou, that same instinct was being translated into receipts tacked to walls. Economists argued the choice in familiar terms. Option 1, yield to pressure, reopen doors to legacy suppliers, enjoy short-term price relief, and risk dependency resetting in months. Option 2, hold the line, accept initial friction, and see if partners deliver training, spare parts, and ownership structures that actually last. Neither path was painless. One felt predictable, the other untested. And human nature, across cultures, tends to prefer the discomfort it already understands. By nightfall, the contradictions were visible. In Washington, panels rehearsed warnings of reckless brinkmanship. In Ouagadougou, shop fronts opened with new signage, and workers compared their first training logs over evening meals. The same story read as risk in one capital and as routine in another. And as the city settled, the hum of generators mixed with quiet voices, an uneasy calm that carried the sense that harder blows were still to come. The louder the criticism grew abroad, the quieter the coordination became inside Africa. Ministers from Accra to Dar es Salaam began comparing clauses line by line, almost in secret, as if discipline itself might be the shield. One trade official remarked that the same wording, technology transfer, local hiring, penalties for missed milestones, was showing up in multiple drafts. What once looked like isolated defiance started resembling a regional pattern. Reports confirmed that shipping corridors were being redrawn to bypass overpriced choke points. A committee in Senegal mapped supply routes that kept margins inside the region instead of bleeding across oceans. Bankers who once dismissed African factories as too risky visited plants with prepaid orders in hand. The shock that rattled Wall Street looked like a template in West Africa. On the ground, the change filtered into daily choices. A taxi driver explained to a passenger that shorter routes meant less fuel wasted, not because of theory, but because he could now finish his shift an hour earlier. A grandmother pointed to crates of fruit stamped with cooperative labels, saying they tasted no different. But this time, the farmer's name was on the box. If people can link product to person, trust grows faster than price cuts ever could. And as surveys often show in the US, most consumers say they want local, yet only act on it when the link is visible and convenient. The same psychology was being played out here. just in a more urgent context. American panels debated whether Burkina Faso's path was a revolt against the global order or just a local stunt. But the vocabulary shift was telling. First, crisis, then brinkmanship, and now realignment. The language softened because prices at home were already rising, and voters rarely tolerate paying more just to sustain a narrative. For every headline in New York, there was a receipt in Ouagadougou that told the opposite story. By dusk, students in the capital stood on rooftops pointing to cranes cutting across the skyline. They argued whether their continent was finally becoming a maker instead of a market, not in slogans, but in lesson plans and training logs. The city exhaled into the night, steady but not serene, carrying the sense that the next test wouldn't come from within, but from pressures gathering just beyond its borders. American headlines stopped calling it a crisis the moment prices at home inched higher. Anchors switched to softer terms: realignment, regional shift, but the change in language revealed something deeper. The pressure was being felt where it wasn't supposed to be. In Ouagadougou, ministers posted plain schedules of project openings with no triumphant music. A warehouse converted from a foreign franchise filled with bolts of fabric stacked in neat rows. Apprentices recited maintenance steps in local languages, not for the cameras, but because the manuals were written that way. The absence of spectacle was the spectacle itself. Across the Atlantic, analysts admitted that sanctions might backfire, welding African capitals together rather than pulling them apart. A leaked memo even warned that public punishment could turn Traoré into a symbol far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Meanwhile, procurement officers in Ghana signed trial orders for school meals, posting receipts online so parents and auditors could verify deliveries. The proof wasn't in speeches, it was in rice on plates and uniforms in classrooms. For ordinary people, these shifts carried weight in the smallest details. A market vendor explained that perishables arrived fresher now because staffing incentives cut transit delays. A teacher noticed her students stopped asking whether lunches would run out. If human beings can predict tomorrow's basics, they start building longer horizons, whether that's saving, studying, or planning families. And research shows most Americans do the same. When the bills stop surprising, ambition expands quietly. The dilemma remained. Choose immediate relief by reopening to old suppliers and risk dependency returning overnight. Or choose the harder road of enforcement, audits, and regional coordination, knowing each step will be contested. Neither path promised comfort, but one offered the chance for dignity that lasts beyond a discount. As evening settled, Ouagadougou was quieter than the rhetoric around it. Generators hummed, receipts were pinned to corkboards, and families compared prices that no longer felt like permission, but like planning. The headlines abroad kept searching for a label, but on the ground the story was already writing itself in smaller, steadier lines, lines that hinted the real confrontation wasn't ending, only shifting into a new phase that no one could yet define. Global markets moved on as if it were just another tremor. Yet in Burkina Faso, the ground felt permanently shifted. That's the paradox. What New York dismissed as volatility, families in Ouagadougou experienced as predictability. Diplomatic notes from Washington framed the episode as a manageable disruption. In Paris, analysts called it a regional test, but receipts in local markets told a different story. Rice shipments logged on time. Workshops opening with manuals printed in-country. For outsiders, it was a chart. For insiders, it was dinner on the table. The comparison is stark. Before, contracts were drafted far away and enforced only in headlines. After, clauses came with enforcement steps and penalties paid in cash, not promises. Before, a porter took wages in silence. After, he signed his name on a rate sheet nailed to the wall. If people can connect effort to outcome, they don't just work differently, they plan differently. And most Americans know this rhythm too. When bills stabilize, confidence spreads quietly into choices about schools, mortgages, even how far ahead to dream. The trade shock revealed a choice that goes beyond Burkina Faso. Choose speed, and prices might dip today, but control slips away tomorrow. Choose discipline, and friction stings at first, but sovereignty hardens into routine. Neither path is cost-free, but the measure of gain may lie in whose hands get to hold the pen. As night closed over Ouagadougou, the noise of speeches gave way to the steadier sound of machines, contracts, and classrooms. Markets abroad saw only numbers recovering. Streets at home felt the weight of something else, an ordinary kind of stability that had been missing for years, fragile but visible, as if a new map was slowly being drawn in real time.